food security session that we are hosting here as the Munich Security Conference. My name is Michael Wirtz. I have the pleasure and the honor to moderate this panel. We are still waiting for the chair of the German Green Party, Ricarda Lang. She got stuck in traffic, probably an experience you can relate to if you have been here yesterday. She will join us shortly, but since we only have 45 minutes and want to make the most out of this conversation, I'd like to start. You might be asking, why is a traditional national security organization like the Munich Security Conference engaging in food security conversations? The answer is a really easy answer. These are key foreign and security policy issues, and we want to contribute in elevating those to the level that we feel is necessary. To do that, we have a panel today that will address the issue of food security from different angles, and I would like to start with a question for Dr. Songwei, who is a co-chair of the UN High-Level Climate Panel. Dr. Songwei, last year you gave an interview and you said, crises are a fork in the road. You can crumble under their weight or build solid resilience when it propels you into a future and a more secure and sustainable future. Are we crumbling, or are we on a good way when it comes to the nexus between climate and food towards a more sustainable future?
Thank you. First of all, let me start by thanking the Munich Security Conference for now putting food in its agenda. I think that it's a particularly important issue, and we know that food has been weaponized. Unfortunately, we've seen that recently, that food has been weaponized in many parts, in many geographies in the world. Also to thank everybody. I know that it's still early, and getting in sometimes is a little bit of a harrowing experience, but here we are. Listen, very quickly, I would say that we are in a fork in the road, and we are optimistically, I must say, having been now at COP for 2 days, probably on the right path. Yesterday, we heard the announcement from the Minister of Environment of UAE and Bill Gates of $200 million for more and better regenerative seeds. This was done in the main hall. I think that there is much more focus and much more understanding that, you know, the 500 and more million people that are going hungry are not just a health crisis, but also a security crisis. And that if we cannot do something about that, we will end up in a much worse place. So I think there is now recognition of that fact. And hopefully what we now need is, now that there is recognition, how can we get finance and how can we get action at scale? And that is, I think, the big question that we must put to ourselves going forward.
Thank you. Just a very brief follow-up. If you talk to traditional security types and they ask you, why is the food and climate nexus really important for our strategic thinking? What is your answer?
Listen, I think we have seen Ukraine, and we saw the crisis that Ukraine caused. In untold territories, we never really understood the linkages between the Black Sea access, security, and access to wheat and grain. Countries like Egypt, 70–80% of their wheat comes from that part of the world. And so immediately, not only did that happen, but what ended up also happening is we got other countries putting now non-trade barriers, blocking exports, which made the situation even worse, leading then from a security issue, which was essentially an invasion, to a food crisis that was untold, and we have 30% food inflation in many of the African countries today, never before seen in 30 years. So I think the link is almost, direct, and we need to do something about it.
Thank you very much. Cindy McCain, let me turn it over to you. You're the Executive Director of the World Food Program. You have a lot of responsibility on your shoulders. You come well prepared because you have represented the United States at the Rome-based agencies before. So what are some of the systemic reforms that we need? Because it seems that we have to move from a donor-driven, aid-oriented conversation to a more strategic conversation, as Dr. Songwei has pointed out. And like looking at it from the top level, what are the 2–3 main things that come to mind when you think about where you want to be 5 years from now?
Right.
first of all, I want to thank the Munich Security Conference for having me. And I also really want to thank you for making the argument and discussing the item of food security and national security and why, both of them. I really thank you for that. I view this as a very reasonable thing that we need to be doing. And first of all, we've got to talk about early warning systems and anticipatory systems.
Yes.
You know, they're just waiting for weather patterns and not being able to communicate and farmers not having the information to know what to do is critical here. So that's number one. Number two, community-led resilience programs. It has to be, in my opinion, a ground-up kind of thing to make sure that the communities understand and that the communities can work together to make sure that they can mitigate what has happened or could happen in any of this. And I think number three is, of course, the climate risk insurance programs that are now popping up everywhere, and we are a participant in that. Those have been very helpful in not only helping those who have been affected by it, but also reassuring that those who could be affected by it will have support in the long run. All three of these items, I think, are critical to what we need to be doing in the future, and for not just from WFP, but collectively within the climate change group, meaning the collective we kind of thing.
Right.
Thank you.
Following up on what Dr. Songwe has argued, that the nexus between security and these previously seen as soft issue conversations need to be strengthened. You have a close personal relationship with the President of the United States. You talk a lot to people in the White House. What is your feeling? People that are traditionally working on national security issues, do they listen to you as a peer among equals in these conversations?
They are now. This is something I'm very happy to say the White House and the U.S. government has taken up in whole. They're not only very aware of it, but they're working collectively now on possible, not just the issues, but possible solutions. And you know, where we go from here. What's the next 10 years, the next 30 years, 20, 30 years look like? So I'm very pleased with what the White House is doing, and I know that they've been listening to all of us in this within this arena for just those answers.
Thank you very much. Nisreen Elsaim, you have a long history as a climate activist. You've been parts of the International Young Activists Summit. This is your 10th COP. So you have heard the security nexus analysis, and you have heard some of the ideas that Cindy McCain has outlined. Given your experience in these COP environments and given what you've heard right now on the panel, where do we stand? Do you agree? Where do we need to do things much more urgently?
Thank you very much. You make me feel old.
That was not my intention. I apologize.
No, but it is true. Well, at the beginning, the discussion about climate change, peace and security itself was a huge problem. Although the first linkages between the climate change, peace and security was actually by the Secretary General himself at that time, it was Ban Ki-moon, when he described the war in Darfur against Sudan as the first climate-driven war, and this was 2007. So even before the 10 years I spent in COPs, the discussion started way before that. Yet still the linkages between climate change, peace and security have a lot of doubts. And if we did not really address that, it is a problem. This COP this year, we have a peace thematic day, and which is the first time we have a peace thematic day. It's the 3rd of December. But even if we looked at the history and how things have been done, climate change can lead into food and security crisis. Food and security crisis can lead into conflict, but it's also the opposite. Conflicts can lead to food and security crisis, and climate change will only increase these crises. Again, Sudan, my country, is a very good example when things are messed up. As we are speaking right now, more than 9 million in Sudan are IDPs because of the ongoing conflict. And there is I think almost 500,000 in the Chadian borders, and a lot of people are suffering food insecurities because of the conflict. But now let's see the states that doesn't have ongoing conflicts. As we are speaking, there is no winter. So this year, the weather didn't even get a bit cooler in a lot of spaces. So most of the winter crops were not being able to actually being harvested. The eastern states had floods because of the heavy raining at many areas. So this is another factor that, of course, impacted the agricultural process internally. And there's no way that we will speak about sustainable humanitarian support if we can't localize the food production system. And we cannot localize the food production system if climate crisis keep hitting the production. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me connect to this right away. Dr. Songwei, you have written, and I'm being told that we have to focus on speaking into the microphone so we are being heard. You have written and argued that intra-African trade on food commodities is a key asset in order to addressing the issues that we've been talking about. Why is the situation still so challenging? Nisreen has pointed out that this debate has been going on for a good decade or even longer. It is not rocket science to see that there is a relationship between migratory movements, climate change, food insecurity, conflict and fragility. Why does it take us so long to get the conversation more focused and moving forward?
Thank you. I think three answers. The first one is political. For a very long time, and again, I think that is what the COPs have begun to do, is the voice of the farmers was not heard. So in some sense, we didn't have that kind of political momentum. I think after 2008, when there was a lot of sort of, with the food and financial crisis, I think food security actually came on the agenda. And I remember in the White House at the time with Timothy Geithner, we launched the first global agricultural food security program. And it was called food security for a reason, and it was global. I think that's one thing. The second thing is financing. And technology today is helping to solve some of the financial issues, because one of the issues that we had was just the sort of lack of information on pricing. And so food was never seen as a lucrative business, right? I've written papers on food as a business and not a humanitarian sector. And I think until we can move the food discussion from a humanitarian discussion to a business, private sector driven sector, it is going to be very difficult to lift that up. Because you need to build the farm to market roads, you need to build the infrastructure to be able to move these goods between places. And then finally, there's the climate challenge. Today, if you're in South Africa, they've had a bumper crop in the north and they have a drought in the south. And this is the same for Africa, right? We've had 40 years of the worst droughts in the Horn of Africa, but we are seeing places maybe like Ethiopia that are having a bumper crop on wheat. We're seeing Senegal that is doing very well on rice, and we have to begin to see how we can balance the climate change action with moving food, and that's why, at least on the African continent, we are pushing the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement to see how we can make sure that when there is scarcity in Malawi, we can move the maize from Mali to Malawi. And finally, I think something that we've all been working on is really food-resistant, seed-resistant crop, right? If you go to the north of Mali today, they used to have 2 tons per hectare of rice. Today they're having 10 tons per hectare of rice because institutions like the CGIAR are having this kind of food-resistant crop. And I think that is actually the frontier. It's technology, both on the bio side, on the crop, and making the seed market a real and sustainable market and moving a little bit away from the humanitarian conversation.
Thank you very, very much. Cindy McCain, I assume that the private sector cooperation question is also something that you think a lot about. It is a theme that is recurring in the World Bank, in the regional development banks. Can you talk a little bit about what your thinking is of how you walk that tightrope between making sure that organizations like yours get the best out of private sector cooperation and at the same time generate as much impact as you can?
I sincerely appreciate that question. Governments cannot do this alone. Governments simply can't, and we can no longer rely on governments to do that. Private sector has to be a part of this. It is a moral imperative, in my opinion, that private sector is a part of this and becomes a part of this. Now, so what does that mean? It means all of us that work in this arena, we bring private sector organizations in, but we have to work collectively on this. Siloing and doing this the old way simply won't work. And so what we try to do is when we do bring private sector in, then we make sure we share what goes on and share what we're doing and share what's happening. So that other organizations can either take part or at least know what we're doing, so we can amplify each other. It's a common problem that's occurred, but it's something I think private sector can be very helpful in mitigating as well.
Nisreen, what is your take on these issues? Obviously, especially with regard to the African continent, there is a lot of investment, there's a lot of good stories. There are also stories that are not that great, and even under the current circumstances, we are hearing that some of the traders are making generous profits out of Ukraine right now, which is not really the situation where you want to look at the bottom line, but rather how to stabilize a country. What do we have to look for to make sure that this is really joint efforts and not the use of government or public funding for private interest?
Thank you for this question. Well, basically, the idea and the problem with climate change in general, but specifically the food security, is that you need to look at this problem holistically. Unfortunately, uni solutions will not work, because very soon the other elements will put a lot of pressure to the point that your solution that you actually presented fail. To be honest, and I've shared this before, I don't really see why Africa should be impacted if Ukraine have a war. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, and this is what I was talking about earlier. Localizing the food system, food production, and not only localizing it, but make it accessible to the people. Yes, it's important to have a resistant seed, but if you don't have water, then even a resistant seed will not work. Yes, it is important to have climate-smart agriculture, but if you don't have electricity, then it will not be smart. So access to energy, access to water, it's a full package, unfortunately. And if we didn't address this full package, it will definitely not work. Of course, stabilizing the countries and have peace in place is a key, because if you have war, then no one can do any kind of agriculture, no one can do any kind of food producing processes. So it is important to look at the full picture and try to address all of the problems from different perspectives, not from only one.
Thank you very much, and I see that Cindy McCain is nodding, so I think you're in agreement here. Ricarda Lang, welcome. We are very glad that you made it and overcame the logistical challenges of this COP.
I'm very sorry for being late. It was a nightmare out there.
It is what it is. I will bring you into the conversation. Before I do that, let me invite all of you to think about how you'd like to intervene. You should be able to just push the button on your microphone panel, and ideally I will see you on this screen and will be able to call upon you. I have to mention the numbers of your microphones so the team can activate the microphone for you. Please don't feel insulted if I call you not with your name but with a number. It's nothing personal. Ricarda, your party, the German Green Party, is one of the trailblazers in the climate conversations since the late 1980s. You're the co-chair of that party. You're part of the German government, a big donor country, not only to events like this, but also to multilateral organizations, including Cindy McCain's organization. Dr. Songwe has mentioned the need for climate finance. We've been talking about the nexus between food and climate security and how the interplay comes together. If you have conversations in the German government about where the country needs to go and about where German multilateral engagement needs to go, what are your sharpest and most poignant arguments that you make towards your peers and your coalition partners to move the conversation forward?
Well, I think really something we and you probably already have talked about on the panel, making the security issue because actually it's not just about helping people and altruism, which should be enough to kind of engage with these subjects, but really to understand that this is an issue of security. And I think when we talk about food security or food insecurity, there's still a rather long way to go. While in some other areas, maybe when it comes to climate protection in a more like narrow frame, I think there's a big understanding now in the politics, when I look at the German politics, for example, that this is a question of security. When we're talking about food security, when we're talking about agricultural resilience, there still sometimes is this kind of playing the short-term solutions against the long-term solutions. We saw that very much, for example, when the Ukraine war happened, which of course was a big shock also on the crops market, which was a shock on many like food supply chains, and then suddenly the argument of hunger and the argument of food insecurity was pushed forward to kind of prevent agricultural structural changes. And people were saying, well, we wanted to have more biodiversity, we wanted to have more resilience, we wanted to have more like going away from the big industrial complexes towards the smaller complexes. But we can't do this right now because the people need to be fed. And so there's still the thinking of, well, if we do it short-term sighted, this will be the biggest weapon against hunger, while I think it is what leads to insecurity. It is what leads to all the problems we are having on an international level and on a national level. And so I think really what is important to me is kind of showing that those solutions that have the best effect on a long-term scale are the ones that make us most secure, are the ones that provide food security, and we can't play them against short-sighted saying of, well, we have to do now. And the second part would be, well, geopolitical argument. If we're talking about loss and damage, for example, and I think it was a big step that 2 days ago that Germany and the UAE said we're going to step forward and we're going to give the 100 million towards the loss and damage fund, even though we know it's not going to be enough. We know that this is just a first step, but I think it was an important step. And this is also, I think, a question of geopolitical relevance. If countries like Germany, if countries like all the countries within the European Union want to stay relevant within the world, it's going to be about how much other countries, and especially countries from the global south, feel like they can trust us. Because they are saying, and rightly so, you haven't held up to your promises. You have been telling us what to do for a long time. You have been telling us what you are going to do, but especially when it comes to climate fencing, you have not been holding up. And I think this has really led to a loss of trust in the past. And this loss of trust is for us a geopolitical problem, because then countries are going to turn more towards China, more towards other countries, and therefore I think really linking the geopolitical question, the question of food security, and also of our security has been rather successful, something that, for example, Annalena Baerbock has been doing a lot within her term as a foreign minister.
Thank you. So while we in this room might readily agree that a world with two food systems, one that works in the north and one that doesn't work in the south, is not a good world, you also, as an elected member of the German parliament, have to run election campaigns. So if people say, I'm concerned about the suffering of people in other parts of the world, but this is very expensive. You had the first budget cuts in Germany since 2008. There's a lot of financial strain on the entire system. If somebody says, look, I feel for those people, but I have my issues here at home, why should we be interested in spending even more money, quote unquote, on the global south? What is your answer?
Well, because not doing it is going to be more expensive. Because the consequences, I mean, we live in a globalized world, and even in a world that would be less globalized, still like challenges that face everybody in the world would meet us as well. But in the world we live in, we saw it with COVID, for example. I think the global north was rather egoistical in the beginning of COVID. And they were like saying, oh, how can we get the vaccines to us? And in the end, we saw that this led to us being hit with another wave of COVID, another wave of COVID again, because if the crisis is interlinked and the solution is not, it's just going to hit you harder in the future. And I think this is really something that we are trying to push forward within the German debate, really showing the people that if we leave other parts of the world with the problems, it's not just unjust, it's not just irresponsible because we were causing the problems or we are a big part of causing the problems, but it's always going to lead to higher costs, more crisis, more migration in the future. And I think this is also something in the moment of the German debate, we have a lot of discussion about migration,
Right.
and which is a big challenge to us at the moment, but seeing that the climate crisis, and especially not being able to finance adaptation, not being able to support in the situation, is going to lead to much more migration. I think migration is a good thing to happen to the world, and also a good thing to happen to Europe. We need it, but it's going to lead to unorganized. It's going to lead to migration that goes along with a lot of suffering, with a lot of pain. And I think therefore to show, well, if you want to have it in order, if you want to have it in a working way, we need to finance those things. This is really just about our protection as well.
Thank you. I guess if you have elections in September 2025, we'll see how successful your arguments are, and good riddance to you. I am going to start the game of numbers. If you are kind enough to introduce yourself, I am calling upon number 16, and upon number 7, I feel like in a bingo hall here. It's really funny. Please, and then number 10. I'm taking those 3, and then we'll take it back to the panel. Be brief if you can. We have 16 minutes and 24 seconds.
Right. Am I on? Yes, I'm on. Tim Benton, Research Director at Chatham House. I've been working in this area for about 10 years. 3 brief comments, and they will be brief. It's not just about production. It's also about demand and markets. And so just as an example, we calculated soon after the invasion of Ukraine that had Europeans eaten white meat 1 day a week less, it would have freed up more than the grains that were trapped in Odessa and could have diffused the food price spike. So the way that food that's available is used is kind of important. Secondly, trade and infrastructure, we tend to forget the importance of the small number of bottlenecks, choke points through which particularly grains go. There are 7 or 8 in the world, of which the Black Sea is one. We should have learnt our lessons, but it's the transport infrastructure that's also important. And then the third brief point is there isn't a right answer in the sense of being globally embedded in international trade networks creates risks of transmission and the weaponization of food, but localization and self-sustainability creates other sorts of risks. And that balance is very dynamic, and what worries me is that as we securitize the issue of food security, we undermine the ability of the market to move stuff around, and therefore we make the matter worse. So we're in a danger of being in a geopolitical ratchet that things get more tense over the next 10 years, not less tense. So comments on that. Over.
Thank you for making a complex issue even more complicated. Bram Govertz, I'm going to call upon you, and if you don't mind, very briefly saying a few words about CIMIT, the organization that you are running in Mexico. Number 7.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And my name is Bram Govertz. I'm the Director General of CIMIT, one of the CGIAR centers. And we safeguard biodiversity of maize and wheat, generate those drought-resistant, disease-resistant seeds, but also design the production systems that should be more resilient, more apt for water and energy. And allow me to first say thank you to the German government, because you are a very generous donor to those efforts, but also thank you to Executive Director McCain for your leadership in the World Food Program, but also before that, we need those voices to keep food security on the agenda. I think as we are here together, looking at the nexus of water, energy, and food, because I think that was mentioned, and how climate change is actually hammering on all of those points of those that triangle. Looking at it as a lens from peace and security, I think is actually a way to have the conversation and to come together. No peace without food, but also no food without peace. So they are very strongly interlinked. And I see an opportunity Me coming from a somewhat slower paced, call it pre-development and development organization, we design the solutions that can be put forward for that longer term redesign and creation of resilience. And then we have a World Food Program that needs to respond fast to a crisis. It's a different time horizon, but still I think we need to find that space in the middle. And to be very concrete, can the next time seed needs to be delivered to farmers, can we make sure it's drought resistant seed? So we slowly build up that resilience curve upward. So how do we create that space of conversation between the two communities? And how do we show up together so we don't fall in the trap of it is the short term versus the mid and the long term, but that we can clearly say we're showing up together because there's a continuum and we can look at this together in that sense.
Great.
Other side of just quick comment, I also think we need to be clear on the fragility of the system. Our food system is extremely fragile for the future, but also for any bad actor that would want to target something. Actually, the food system would be something very attractive given the fragility of that system per se. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Let me bring in Mr. Wormser, and I'm going to ask you, Cindy McCain, to respond to Bram's question, but you'll have a few minutes to think about it while we take Mr. Wormser and then Aaron Sikorsky in the first round. Number 10.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the honor to be here. It's a great honor. Security conference and food is very important that the topic of food security is mentioned. But what I miss a little bit, we always hear food security and we have to secure, make sure that everybody has food. But what I'm missing here is the root of the beginning of the value in the supply chain, the raw materials. Everything begins with the raw materials. I'm the founder of a raw material company in the southwest of Norway. We have phosphate, and phosphate is a basic for fertilizer. Now, if we stop tomorrow to produce fertilizer, only 40% of the population of the world have food, and 60% are starving. And this is why I believe we should address the beginning of the value / supply chain, securing raw materials in order to produce fertilizer, in order to have a higher efficiency on food production. I mean, we see it now, the war. Ukraine, Russia have been the major suppliers of wheat and grain to the world, 30%. We've seen in many countries in Africa, Arab states, were 80% importers of those wheat and grain products from Ukraine. And now they fall out of the equation, and you have a domino effect of events that may take place. And you have seen many uprisings in the past 30, 40 years in Arab states because of raising bread prices, which were caused by a lack of supply of wheat and grain. So what are you going to do about that? That's my question.
Very good.
Thank you.
The supply chain question goes to you, Ricarda, among other things. Aaron, please come in and share your thoughts. That's number 27. I think the microphone will be switched on automatically.
You know, Michael, one of the questions you asked the panel is how do you make the case to security actors, right, that food security is a national security issue? And I would argue one opportunity there is to look at what security actors themselves are saying about food security and using them as spokespeople. And so just two quick examples I'll give you. In the US, the National Intelligence Estimate on Climate Change on National Security, which is an unclassified document, talks quite extensively about the risks food security, insecurity poses to social disruption, political turmoil, and conflict, and I would commend that document to you. Also, the head of US AFRICOM, Africa Command, General Langley, has also talked about this a lot on the continent. And so leveraging people like that to bring into the conversation, I think, can be really helpful in moving this along. And sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm the director of the Center for Climate and Security in Washington, D.C. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron. So there were 4 questions. I'll ask the panelists for very brief answers because then I have one last question for you before we wrap up. Let me start with the supply chain question because I thought that was interesting, Ricarda. This is obviously for industrialized and resource-poor nations like Germany a key question. How do you relate to what Mr. Wormser has brought up? You have 90 seconds.
Okay. Wow, this is really fast. I think you're right that raw materials are essential to the whole debate we are having, and I think when we look at countries like Germany, we have to have two debates. The first one is talking about our own raw materials, because there has been kind of this tendency in the past within the whole of Europe to say, well, we want all the raw materials, but we don't want it within our backyard. And there are many things we don't have, so it's not going to change in a big scale that everything is going to be taken back to Europe. But I think to get kind of away from this not in my backyard attitude, we need to be a little bit clearer on what can also happen within Europe and what can also happen within countries like Germany. And the second one, I mean, the big debate we're having in the last year is about diversifying and seeing how we can get less dependent on single countries when it comes to supply chains, and see how we can kind of diversify it between different countries. And I think this is something that has started, but that also for us as a European country would need much more of a European industrial strategy. Because at the moment, all the countries are doing it too much on the national level. And I think diversifying will only work if it gets more and more European, and then a more European strategic level when we talk about raw materials.
Thank you very much. Nisreen, you have heard Aaron Sikorsky argue that the military and national security community can and probably should be a partner in the conversation we're having here. You're from Sudan. Does this argument make you nervous?
Very much. Well, basically, they have to be not a part of the discussion, but they need to be aware of the discussion. Because, as we mentioned before, if we don't have peace and stability, there is no way that there is a process for making food in the first place. So yes, they should be aware of what's happening, but being part is a bit too much. And if I may have small reflections on what was mentioned before, it really depends on the context, on which context are we talking about. For example, the demand and the markets and the transportation infrastructure. In Africa, for example, as a continent, if you open up this discussion, they will say, dude, what are you talking about? We are very far from this part. And it is now about how to make people receive food and get it to their mouth. It's not even about how much consumption there is and so on. And regarding the food systems, it is very much true. It is fragile. In Sudan, for example, before the war, we had more than 70% losses of post-harvest. And this makes even there is a lot of food being produced in one place, but it is not able to be mobilized to other places where they actually need food. And so it's a loss-loss situation. It's last but not least about the raw materials. The discussion about building the resilience of the communities in order to be able to make the raw materials is very much many times just enough for the survival of the people. Specifically that I always say climate action doesn't build peace, it actually prevents conflict from happening in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Songwei, I'm going to do something that's not fair. I'm going to ask you within a minute and a half to respond to the very first question, the tension between having greater trade within the African continent or other places, and at the same time the tension that potentially arises from a localization of food production and food trade on a minor level. What is the preliminary or the final answer to that?
I don't know if there's a final answer, but I think one of the things that we know for sure is that trade is good for economics and trade is good for growth. So we are, in some sense, always pro-trade. I think what we now need to begin to understand is, what is the infrastructure? I think now we're hearing about friendshoring and, security shoring and all of that. But what we need the most is allocative efficiency, because one of the things I said before is that we need financing. And I don't think that we have enough financing to afford to do economics of agriculture that is not competitive and where allocative efficiency is not the rule. So I think there is going to be a little bit of a tension. The good thing is, my sense is, as we begin to rebuild from Ukraine, we will begin to get a better sense. I mean, India has stopped the exports of rice. I think there is China that is doing the same. Philippines is in a little bit of a struggle with rice as well. But the world is going back to sort of understand how do we do the production and what is the supply chain that's going to work. We still need fertilizer from Morocco. 90% of the world's fertilizer comes from Morocco. you cannot do anything without trading with Africa and Morocco for fertilizer, right? So it's going to be impossible to friendshore into Europe if you need fertilizer from Morocco. So I think there are some things that are just going to have to continue by definition. Thank you.
Thank you. Cindy McCain, the question that Bram Govaerts raised between the short-term and the longer-term strategic questions, people are hungry and need to be helped, but also there need to be systemic investments. How are you negotiating this? Asking you for a brief answer as well.
What I'd like to do just for a moment is address the fragility aspect of this, because you raise a really serious point, and it's a good one. And I'll use Chad as an example, because Chad's not in the conflict, but they're taking the brunt of it, and one spark and that country goes up. So what's my point here? My point is we all need to collaborate on these kinds of things, not only with information, but data, with science, technology, everything to be able to stop it. We can't just rely on WFP and IRC and some of the others to do this job. It takes everybody to do it. With regard to the long-term stuff, there's countries and regions that did not cause this climate crisis, but yet they're on the front lines of it. So what do? We have to make sure that no more livelihoods are destroyed, again, working with governments and countries and building resilience, more importantly, and also being able to predict flows of human beings is another portion of this. It's very complex, and it's something that, again, collaborating is the only way we're going to be able to, in my opinion, to be able to really, truly stop this.
Thank you very much. I'm aware of the fact that there are several more people that would like to intervene. Unfortunately, we are at 1 minute 30 seconds. We also can't linger for extended periods of time because this room is needed, but I invite you to linger on the other side of the door and maybe grab the panelists on their way out. Let me just mention that the Munich Security Conference is not just willy-nilly engaging in food security conversations once in a while. We have a strategic idea of doing this over the course of the next 2 to 2.5 years. There will be a number of food security events at the main conference the second week of February of this year, and we will be also launching an international food security task force that will meet for the first time the first week of May in order to produce tangible ideas of deliverables and policies of governments, multilateral organizations, and the private sector, and we will measure these results in security conferences to come. I'm asking you for a one-sentence answer because we are in the process of designing this food security task force. If I'd ask you, what is the most important issue a Munich Security Conference food security task force should focus on, what is your answer? Nisreen, I'll start with you.
Building resilience.
Thank you very much. Cindy McCain.
Agreed. Building resilience is the most important part.
Fantastic. Dr. Songwei.
Non-tariff barriers.
Non-tariff barriers. And Ricarda Lang.
I have to agree with building resilience. So.
Perfect. This is a 3-2-1. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great pleasure to have this conversation, and we'll keep you posted on the progress of our conversations. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.